So the most common and maybe the most basic way of allowing communication between containers and to the outside world is by exposing ports from our containers. Now, we have seen a bit of this already in the course. A module or two back, we fired up an Apache web server running on port 80 inside of our container, and we mapped that to port 80 on our Docker host, and then we connected through a web browser. Well, let's revisit that scenario now and take a bit of a closer look. So, here we've got a Dockerfile with a bunch of the usual stuff. We've got our base image, package installations, and then we've got this, expose 80. And what this is doing is exposing port 80 on our container to our host. Well, actually, it makes it possible to expose that port at runtime. In order to actually expose it, we need to launch the container with the -p option when doing our Docker run. And we'll get to that in just a second. But for now, we can see that we're going to be installing Apache, exposing port 80, and then down here we've got our entry point instruction, and that specifies Apache as the main process to run inside of our container. Then we've got some arguments to pass to entry point specified here. Now remember, we can override these CMD arguments here at runtime on the Docker run command. But just in case we don't specify anything on the Docker run command, these all serve as good default options. So we're good to go. Let's go and build an image from it. Call it Apache IMG, and away we go. Okay, that's built our Apache image. Now to launch a container from it. So we go Docker run, we'll run it detached, and now for what we're here to see. We go -p to expose ports, and then let's do this. Let's go 5001:80. Okay, what this is saying is map port 5001 on our Docker host to port 80 on our container, and vice versa as well, yeah? Meaning that any connections coming into our host on port 5001 will be forwarded to port 80 on our container. Magic. We'll call it Web 1, and we'll base it on our Apache image. And I think we're good to go. Hit return. Looks good. Quick Docker PS to see if it's there, which it is. And look, we can even see the port mapping there, albeit wrapped over a couple of lines. I think let's jump over to a web browser and test that connection. Now the container's running on our Ubuntu host here in the lab, and I've got name resolution set up so that resolves to Ubuntu 14.04. Oh, there it is, docker.course. And if we just leave it at that and try to connect on the default port, which is port 80, we can see that there's nothing there. Remember, we're talking to our Docker host here. But if we add port 5001 to the end, there we go, we're in business. Remember, 5001 on our host gets mapped to 80 inside of the container. Inside of the container, we're running Apache web server. Now, sure, there's no config in there, so we just get the default page. But we're in business. So that's the basics of mapping ports. In the next lesson, we're going to continue this theme of looking at port mappings.